Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I got to tell you, this is an incredible honor of mine tonight to interview David Crombie, the former mayor of Toronto, former member of parliament, member of cabinet, head of, I think it was called the Toronto Regeneration Trust, a gentleman that I have followed his political career. Mainly, you may not know this, sir, but because my father was named David Crombie, and he was a politician in Markham when you were mayor of Toronto. We used to come from Markham down to Toronto and steal some of your signs and bring them back up to Markham because that was the cheapest way we had to get political signs. Actually, that's a lie. We didn't do that, but we thought about doing it. It was a lot of fun. And I have to say, as far as we know, we're not related, but my father was also David Crombie. And sir, it's a pleasure to meet with you again and chat.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that very, very much. The Crombie legacy is in terms of the name and clan and all has been around but in Toronto, not for very long. The Crombies that I knew from the East End, which probably would have been your family, it was always a bit of a saga. We were a bit cut off because my grandfather, who came from Scotland, went into the First World War and never came back. And so in many ways, that part of the family did atrophied a little bit, picked it up a little later. But there are relatives I've discovered over the years that I have relatives, and I'm always happy to find out that they're smart and good looking.
Well, I have a family Bible in my front hallway that I should show you at some point in time that's got inscribed David Crombie on the front of it. And it was brought from Scotland to Canada in 1820 on a boat.
Wow. I knew of Crombie's coming to Montreal and Quebec, but I didn't. That's really interesting.
Yeah, well, that's where
I'd love to see that.
That's where the Crombies went. My Crombies went to Montreal.
Yeah, they did come. They came from Montreal. That part I knew, and there was a neighbor of mine in North Toronto who was from the Montreal Crombies as well. And we used to try and kid one another that we were related, but he happened to be 6'3" and about 207 pounds.
Not quite the same stature of the tiny perfect mayor.
Exactly. We were a little smaller.
So you grew up in Swansea in the west end of Toronto, I understand.
I did. Both my parents were Swanseites, my grandparents. One came from Scotland. The others have been here since the 1820s. The Beamishes, they were all from Swansea. And so in many ways, Swansea, the village, is still an emotional home. I was last Sunday with my grandson who's in from Amsterdam. We walked along the west shore of Grenadier Pond, and then went in for a little tour of Swansea. It's still an emotional home. Great spot.
I lived for 10 years at Bloor and Jane, and
really, what street?
Armadale.
Armadale. That goes south from Bloor. I sold papers at the corner of where the streetcars used to turn at the blunt end of Jane.
Right.
And then my father's people were on Windermere. My mother's people were on Spadina, on Lavina, and we lived on Ellis. So I love that old place. The village is about still 6,000, bounded on three sides by water.
Yep.
So you're raised with nature in the city in a way which was almost not, I'm sure it's duplicated, but for us, it was a marvel.
Well, I used to take my kids to Hyde Park all the time and to the zoo, and I used to bike into my job downtown Toronto on the Martin Goodman Trail along the waterfront,
right.
and
we
canoed on the Humber River. And so
you know the Humber River. I have pictures of my father spooning my mother in a canoe on the Humber River.
And you launched your political life in Swansea.
No, I didn't actually. I lived in North Toronto for much of my adult life. And it was in North Toronto, the old North Toronto, now not out of the Steeles, but basically that went from Eglinton Hogs to Hogs Hollow. That's where I spent my adulthood on Glencairn.
Why'd you decide to run for council?
I was teaching at Ryerson, and in those days, Ryerson was finding its way in its wings, and you were allowed to do almost anything you liked so long it was a discipline that accommodated the various courses of Ryerson. So I taught radio and television arts students, journalism students, business students, aeronautical engineering students, all of those. And my job was to try and interest them in what we called political economy in those days. politics, economics, and sociology. And I started there in 1962. One day, my class came to me, half a dozen of them, and I still see some of them. And they said, look, you're talking about the Canadian government, it's all very interesting, but we are going to get jobs in small towns and small cities. Hopefully we'll come to the big cities, but we need to know something about local government. And in those days, local government was almost unknown as a place of study. So I said I would find out what I could, and I would deliver some lectures to them. So I went over to City Hall, to the planning department, and got some stuff from them. Went down to the clerk's department and got some stuff from them. I then went over to the library and a bookstore at the University of Toronto, and I found two books that were just out, one within a year of one another. One was Jane Jacobs' Life and Death of Great American Cities, and the other one was Silent Spring. All that material, I fashioned 5 lectures on local government. And that got me interested myself, got my students interested. And in those days, you could pretty well, because Ryerson was on its own, you could assign your students to do things that were not necessarily according to the way they did things at, say the University of Toronto. And so I assigned my students to campaigns. And their job was to knock on doors, be with the candidate, find out what was going on, and then submit a report to me, and I would sort of mark it and talk about it with them. I think they got something out of it, but certainly I got a lot out of it. And so in 1964, with a fellow I was teaching with, Louis Greenspan, God love him, we flipped a coin to see who would run and who would manage. And I ran, he managed, and we got to 4th place. But I was bitten, and I found, so I didn't do anything for another 5 years, but I ran for council in 69. So all of that really came from Ryerson and being a teacher.
What a fascinating start. Unbelievable. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with David Crombie, former mayor of Toronto, former MP, former cabinet minister, head of Toronto Regeneration Trust, a gentleman on urban planning and waterfront revitalization and politics that I think I've always admired, and probably a lot of you have as well. We're going to take a break. Be back with David in just a minute. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. You know, I have this part-time nighttime gig I've got being your radio host.
Very interesting, eh? Good for you.
It really has. It's let me meet some really fascinating people. I had the opportunity to interview former mayor of Mississauga, Hazel McCallion, on her 100th birthday, which was really kind of neat. I've interviewed a lot of different politicians. I've reached out to lots of different business people and economists and whatnot. But I got to tell you, you are a gentleman that I've always admired, and obviously I've followed your career, not just because you've got a great last name, but because, and first name, but because you've been, I think, an inspiration to a lot of people. I don't know whether you describe yourself as a red Tory, but we are one of those people that people from all political stripes would admire and thought of you as someone that could represent all of us. And so thank you for your contribution to Canadian society. And frankly, I think we need more people like that today. And I think we have a real absence, but maybe we'll touch on that later on. But I wanted to ask you, if I could, about Toronto's waterfront, because I think that's something that you've really been focused on. And you know, there's been a lot of issues, whether it be, you know, building trails, waterfront revitalization, Ontario Place, rebuilding the Don River, sidewalk labs, port lands. Tell me what's your vision for the waterfront of Lake Ontario, of Toronto, and what we should be doing?
Well, the vision is really unfolding. It's not perfect, but years ago, when I first got involved in a formal way with the waterfront, I might say again, because I was from Swansea, I used to finish my Globe Mail route at the bottom of Ellis Avenue and look at the lake and go back home. The waterfront has been part of my life all my life. It became more important to me in sort of political planning terms because I saw the waterfront change before my very eyes in the 50s and 60s. Because the waterfront, the railroads which used to anchor the waterfront relocated to north of number 7 highway. The shipping totally changed We were supposed to have the Seaway, which came to us in 1959 or started in 59. The Seaway never happened. And so what happened is the port of Toronto shrunk from what it was a very large, important thing on the Great Lakes to almost zero, not very, very much. And then slowly the waterfront began to be forgotten. People went north to their cottages. People no longer went to the waterfront in the same way as my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, and even a little bit of my own generation. They didn't canoe down the Humber River for a while. So I came to a waterfront in 1970, now 50 years ago, which was devoid of its history, devoid of its use, except for some small bits. People still went over to the island for picnics, but the waterfront was changing. And therefore, we had to rebuild, reestablish what the waterfront meant to us. We're still in that debate. I know it seems like a long time for a debate for 50 years, but on the other hand, people did things as they went along. So in 1971, Bill Davis and Eb Zeidler, wonderful architects and planners, built Ontario Place. That was a stake out there. That said, we're going to have new meaning to the Toronto waterfront. There are other examples I could give. And over the last 50 years, as generations have come, they've added to what is the new Toronto waterfront. And I know that there are still critics about the waterfront. I know there are people who lament that somehow it didn't turn out to be Chicago or it didn't turn out to be New York. They are wrong. Toronto's waterfront is made by the way in which we've added to it over the years. Have we made mistakes? Yes, we have. Have we corrected mistakes? Yes, we have. So the waterfront to me is a definition of what Toronto is about. And that definition includes being able to manufacture a new waterfront in 2.5 generations, and we are doing it. And anybody who doubts that and listens only to the critics, all they need to do, if they like, I will take them personally if you want to get in touch, right? And I'll take them on a tour of the waterfront. They'll be knocked out.
Ontario Place has been very controversial. Lots of critics about the current Doug Ford plans for it. What do you think about Ontario Place, the current plans, and what should happen there?
I had a little bit to do with it as it went along. I was there for the opener in 1971. I was a councillor at Toronto at the time. It was hurt over the years by the provincial government's lack of, all parties guilty, of not understanding that it was a park and therefore needed to be funded. And so therefore they tried to commercialize it, and it kept on losing its charm to people. It is an absolutely splendid, iconic, world-class architectural event. And what it needs to do is remember, first of all, its original understanding, and it was to be a place of respite. It was a place to be, no matter where you were in the world, you were coming to the new Toronto that was emerging, the multicultural Toronto. It was to be a place where families and people could enjoy. It still needs to do that. It still needs to make sure that it represents not just Toronto, but it's Ontario Place and not Toronto Place. So therefore it needs to represent what is really good about Ontario. And one of the things that's happened most recently has been what is now called the William Davis Trail. And if people haven't seen that, they should, because it really goes back to the original understanding of great boulders, the whole parts of the Canadian Shield brought down for that trail. And you can see an aspect of Ontario, so long as they hew to the notion that they are to represent Ontario to Torontonians and the world, then they'll make the right decisions. If they decide that somehow it's how you blow your money on the weekend with your kids, then you can do that anywhere.
So it shouldn't be Canada's Wonderland. Number 2, it's a park.
No, we have a Canada Wonderland, and it's doing fine. It's a park. It's a park with music. It's a park. I mean, it was Michael Huff, one of the great world-class landscape architects. He joined with Eb Zeidler, one of the great architects in the world as well, who just passed away. Those two created something absolutely most of the world would come and see. And so we can recapture that spirit. It won't be exactly look the same, it won't be exactly what they were had in mind, but it should capture that spirit of what Michael Huff and Eb Sider did.
Waterfront Toronto is spending an outrageous amount of money sort of rebuilding the mouth of the Don River, the Portlands. It's going to be a place of parkland. It's going to be a place of a whole bunch of residential development. What's your sense of what's going on at the mouth of the Don and the Portlands?
Well, that's wonderful. I have to say that. I know I sound eternally cheerful, but we worked on that many, many years ago. We made recommendations for naturalizing the mouth of the Don. That is already happening. The Don River is going to be put into the place where God put it a couple of centuries ago. And it's that naturalization of it has been just a pleasure. Been a pleasure to see. Where it's going from here on in is to re-intensify people living on the waterfront. People live on waterfronts. It's not just a place where you go to swim or fish or those, you should be able to do some of that. But people need to live on the waterfront. And what is happening, I think, because of good reasons and some good policies by successive provincial governments, as well as city government, they have done a really fine job. You always need to keep your eye out, because there are always hustlers who would like to make it, who don't want to go all the way around the bases. They want to get up the plate and then come home without going around the bases. And so some people will want to make it something that's useful to them and nobody else. But if we keep our eye on what people want to do with that waterfront, plans are galore. We've got lots of plans. One of the things that people have kind of forgotten is Waterfront Toronto. Before Waterfront Toronto, I was part of Susan Fish, a good old planner and politician, worked with me for years. And Susan wrote an essay called 99 Governments, because we used to have so many out of 4 levels of government at the time, so many agencies involved with the waterfront. There are many people who worked very, very hard to put Waterfront Toronto in place so you could have at least one-stop shopping when it came to good ideas and good places for people. And so keeping Waterfront Toronto and making sure that it's accessible, but making sure that it's the place that we can attach responsibility along with the city and the province, that's really important to the future of the waterfront. But I've walked the waterfront with people from around the world, planners from waterfronts well known. They saw what was possible, and they're seeing that possibility is being developed. So I think that we're on the way. Just make sure that we're modest in our moves, but imaginative in our thoughts.
Modest in our moves, but imaginative in our thoughts. Sounds good. I, just out of interest, last summer, I had the occasion to take my dog down to Cherry Beach. Spectacular. And I went for a nice long walk out Leslie Street Spit, not Pit, sorry. And right. Both were wonderful. And so I agree. I think that, what we could do on that old former Portsland area could be spectacular. What about sidewalk labs? Waterfront Toronto was very positive towards sidewalks. And then I think a lot of criticism came because of worries about, control and knowledge and privacy and stuff like that. And Google and sidewalks left. Was that too bad, or what do you think about sidewalks and what happened there?
I have 2 minds about it. I did not come out. I was asked to public support sidewalk labs because I was unsure about who was controlling it, and therefore where it needed to go to satisfy its own owners and so on. This is not to say there were really good people who came here. Dan Doctorow from New York, who, by the way, is quite sick right now, he led that, and he did a really fine job. He asked me early on when he was here if I would get involved with him, and I said, no, I'm doing some other things. He said, but you understand at least the culture of this place. And I said, well, I try hard. He said, so why don't we meet from time to time? And he had at least a really good take. He said the culture in Toronto is very, very different than the culture in New York and other places that he knew. And he had some good, so we would talk about the culture of how you moved forward in Toronto. And it was, in a sense, it was a clash of cultures. He's trying to do his best, but there was a way in which Americans and at least the people he was involved with, They understood how you developed major projects. And I mentioned a moment ago, be modest in your moves and imaginative in what you want to achieve. And that's the advice I gave him. Let people know where you want to go. Let them know that you want them with you and that you're paying attention to what they're saying. You're just not the guy from out of town with a smile on his face and a shine in his shoes trying to sell a project. And in some ways that wasn't Dan, but there were some people who were pushing that orientation. And I think that hurt them. It had great elements to it, but in some ways we're now going to gain. We're going to gain because we've still got that. I've got the 4 big volumes that they developed. They are really worthy of a course in planning. All right. But we need to do it in our own way. Toronto has a style. Toronto has a way in which it does things. And it's understanding how that works that'll make the project on the waterfront generally, yes, but also where it is. Let me give you an example. Down there now, there's already organizations, developers, some of them led by Waterfront Toronto, and they're capturing some sense of indigenous history on it with residential and so on. There's already some pickup on some of the ideas that came from Sidewalk Labs, but we'll do it in our own way, in our own time. And I think that's what judgment was finally met to Dan Doctorow.
I met someone senior from Sidewalks at one point in time. I won't mention who, but that said that it was a real shame that we opposed everything in the end, and the criticism, and maybe it's the culture issue that you spoke about. And they said, Battery Park, South Street Seaport, and Hudson Yards is remaking Manhattan in a spectacular fashion. And if we brought it to Toronto, any one of those would have been turned down, and that's Toronto's mistake.
Well, I don't. That a couple of points. Battery Park. The lead in Battery Park was done by Michael Dennis. Michael Dennis is a Canadian from Toronto. Yeah, he was on my staff at the City of Toronto, and he was our first housing commissioner. We started a housing department with Michael to build St. Lawrence neighborhood. He's the real author of St. Lawrence neighborhood. After he was through, he went down and helped them build Battery Park, and they went over to London to Canary Wharf. So, but Mike will tell you the culture in each of those three places is very, very different. Would we take the Battery Park? Well, I mean, you now look at what we've got down there now, and look at Ontario Place and its possibility, exhibition across the way, taken together some 450 acres. It's an extraordinary opportunity. Would we take one large thing and say, we adopt it? That's not our way. That is not our way. And by the way, if you go down to Hudson Yards, I don't know if you've been there, but it's a really swell place in some ways. But even the rich can't afford to go there.
It's pretty expensive. I tried to stay in a hotel. It was $750 last Labor Day.
Yeah, that's just for the bathroom.
Harbourfront. Some people have criticized it, saying it's a concrete wall between the city and the lake. What do you think?
I mean, no, I don't think so. I think Harbourfront had its beginning way 50 years ago, and it was the federal government trying to get into doing some development on the Toronto waterfront. It had early on had some difficulties. Early on, there was a great imagination. A fellow by the name of Cohen had some great imagination for it. Some others did. And I think the way it's worked out is now it was all that acreage from York Street over to Bathurst. It's now 10 acres. And I think Harbourfront's done a really fine job of reinventing itself. I'm only, at any rate, yes, I think that's where it fits in now very nicely. And I was down, walked just before the snow came, and I'm walking along the waterfront. It is, changes are coming. Changes are coming. I mean, even I oppose the expansion of the airport, but I don't want to lose the airport. I want a good airport that can still make enough money to survive, but it doesn't need to be a second international airport. So what we've done is actually shaped a waterfront airport in our own image, rather than simply adopting some other airport from some other place. The more we pay attention to who we are and who we think we want to be, rather than taking it off the shelf because a stranger shows up in town with a plan, the better off we are.
Gardner Expressway. The portion east of Don Valley Parkway has come down, and I think it's spectacular that it's now down. Other people thought that the Gardner Expressway, many people think that Gardner Expressway was a barrier between downtown and the waterfront. But now that the buildings come up almost to the edge of the Gardner Expressway, it's almost disappeared. What do you think should happen to the Gardner Expressway?
Well, that's what should happen to the Gardner Expressway is happening to the Gardner Expressway. And there's no doubt when it was built, it was a symbol of progress, great symbol of progress. I remember it well. 1959, when they opened up and Gardner cut the ribbon, all of that. It was a wonderful progress, but it became a barrier to the lake. There is no doubt. People forgot what was there before. So in the West End, where you're from, Brian, the old Parkdale Canoe Club, which is now what are the lovely club out by
Boulevard Club.
Now the Boulevard Club. That was the Parkdale Canoe Club, but Parkdale Canoe Club died because of the expressway, because the Parkdale wasn't down to the water anymore. So we lost that. The Gardner became a barrier, and we lost a lot of stuff that was already there. Having said that, it did play its role. I was one of those who argued, it still do, that it should be taken down, certainly over towards Bathurst, because it's so high up around west of Bathurst that you now got a whole activity underneath it, right? We got the Beltway, and so there are Bentway rather. So you've got activity there. So I think we're now absorbing it. I might say, by the way, it was some long-headed planners some years ago who at least kept open the idea that you would take down the Gardner and have a street. So all the buildings that were built were still built in a way that you could have a street if you took down the Gardner. And now that's exactly increasingly what you've got. The Gardner is disappearing into a street.
Really? That's interesting. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with David Crombie. And we're going to switch from talking about Toronto and the waterfront to a little bit of his political career. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm interviewing tonight David Crombie, not a relative of mine, at least as far as we know, but he was a gentleman that I always looked up to and his political career. And sir, you were a successful councillor. You were part of, I think, a group they called the Reformers. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And you decided to run for mayor. Why did you decide to run for mayor?
Well, I had been involved in, let me call it local government politics since I mentioned earlier, from Ryerson days. With 1964, we started a group called Civic Action, or not the Civic Action League. And it was to develop policies and platforms and get people interested in local government. Toronto was changing substantially in every way you could think of. Economically, it was becoming stronger. We were attracting people from around the world, so becoming far more multicultural. There was a big changes. And so that was a very exciting time in the late 60s and 70s. And so in 1969, I ran for council as the president of Civic Action League, and brought in, and there were other groups in the city at that time. We became the Reform group on council. In a sense, when 1972 came around, it was a 3-year term in those days. I had a decision to make. I was still at Ryerson. I was as director of student services. There was thoughts that I would, the presidency was changing and that I might want to stay with Ryerson. There were other thoughts my wife had about what we ought to be doing. And make a long story short, I decided that I would run for mayor with the assumption that I probably would not win. But for me, it would have been kind of finishing off where I'd started 7 to 8 years before. and saying, here's what I think ought to be done. We did win, and that changed everything, but that's why I ran for mayor. It was basically summing up where I'd spent a lot of time the previous 7 years.
And you had an incredibly successful time as mayor, and people loved you. They called you the tiny perfect mayor. What did you do to deserve being appreciated and have such high poll results?
Well, I showed up. I showed up every morning. No. The truth. I mean, these are, you never know till you know later on. But there was a tremendous creative energy in the late 60s and 70s as it focused on city planning, focused on affordable housing, focused on environmental matters. And that was early on. So it was, and there were major issues like the Spadina Expressway, like the future of the waterfront. All of those issues played a part of it. Affordable housing. Even now, again, a really important issue, was very, very important then, because the affordability for working people, for middle-class people, was slowly getting out of hand. Not for everybody, obviously, but for many people. And at any rate, it wasn't so much what I did, but it really, and I'm not just being silly, in a silly way, modest. It was being able to gather together some really exciting ideas with practical approaches to them, and bringing them all together. I might say I had a sister at the same time who ran out in Mississauga for the school board. And she was there for the next 30 years.
I didn't know that.
Her name was, she was Ruth Crombie, but she's known out there as Ruth Thompson. And there's a middle school named after her, the Ruth Thompson Middle School in North Mississauga. That's my sister. And the reason I mention it is that it wasn't just in Toronto. There was a sense that our time had come if we were willing to put in the energy and the imagination. And we attracted, and I'll finish off this point if you like, with it. We really benefited by immigration. Immigration, if you had to pick one thing that made the new Toronto for us, and still is making it, it is immigration. Because we attracted people from the US, from Quebec, from South Africa, all around the world. And they became our architects, our planners, our business people, our school teachers, our nurses, our doctors, blah, blah, blah. So we benefited a lot from immigration.
You mentioned the residential development south of the St. Lawrence Market, now known, I think, as Crombie Park. And housing affordability was a big issue during your time. It is an issue today. I think the solution at that time was mixed housing, where people paid market rents and other people didn't pay market rents. What do you think the solution is with affordability today, sir?
The solutions that were available then or made available are the same solutions as are available to us today. And I'm involved right now in some of the housing issues, not only here, but in other parts. And they are ways in which you go about increasing the supply, but not just a raw supply of any kind of housing, market housing. That is not going to bring down the price. You have to have tailored to market usage. What kind of housing for which kinds of people where? The magic of the St. Lawrence neighborhood, Crombie Park, you call it, is that every one of those buildings for over 10,000, probably up to 12,000 people were co-op. They're all co-op. Now, there were two. Some of them turned out to be later on rental, but they were co-op. And so that meant allowed you to be able to have a piece of ownership while at the same time you were making it affordable. And that required that there be participation, financial participation from the feds, from the province, and from some cash in kind through property, land, from the local government. So it was defining those policies that Michael Dennis, Susan Fish, Ken Greenberg, Joe Barrage, all of those names. They were all young planners in those days. And they helped curate affordable housing in Toronto. that can be done again. It takes a certain will. In the 80s and 90s and early part of the new century, we got away from it all because we accepted the argument that somehow government has no role. And there are many people who sincerely and honestly believe that, but they're wrong. And their wrongness has caused great strain and great pain for people who cannot afford housing today. So we have to get back to having a role for government and the use of publicly owned land in a way which we can make it affordable.
I interviewed Joe Barrett, Urban Strategies. You mentioned his name, and he said the problem is government. He said that NIMBYism in government and councillors that feel like they're czars in their own little fiefdoms that won't allow development density height to go ahead and only care about their current electors and the next election rather than thinking about the good of the city in the long term are the problem. And what we need is people that are elected citywide that think about the whole city rather than just their own little ward, and don't give in to NIMBYism and know that we need a lot more supply of housing. That was his assessment. What do you think of that?
Now, I yield to no one in my love and affection for Joe Barrett. And I mean that. He was one of those young planners when I was there, and he made an enormous contribution and still is. And I see Joe on a regular basis. And he's partially right. I'll give him that. He's partially right. You have to worry about what he calls NIMBYism, that government's the problem. He's on dangerous ground, though, it seems to me. Government is not the problem. It's how you use government and the inability to use it properly that's the problem. And if Joe thinks that only that government's the problem, and therefore you go to the marketplace, you will forever have no green fields and no cheap housing. So you really need to do is bring them together, right? And you don't do that necessarily by saying the other guy's the problem. You do it by saying, we've got a problem. How do we bring that together? Now, I know Joe well enough to know that he believes just what I said.
Okay. Amalgamation. Was it a good idea?
Yes. Yes, I know all my old pals, all my old friends, all the people on my side of the political spectrum, they were against it. But I was for it and still am. The reason was that it seemed to me the Toronto that I knew was much larger than these artificial boundaries, right? The Toronto that I knew was very expansive. In fact, much of it was bounded by natural boundaries. That was my Toronto. And so when they brought in amalgamation, bear in mind, when they brought in a metropolitan Toronto, metropolitan government, there was no other metropolitan government in North America. We were the first in Toronto to have metro government. That's regional government.
I didn't know.
Let me call it regional government. Okay, they didn't have it. The only other place they tried to do it was in Miami, Dade County in Miami, and the voters said no. And the voters in Toronto probably would have said no to amalgamation in 1953 as well, except they didn't get a chance to vote because the provincial government said, we thought about what you all want to do, but we're going to have a thing called Metro. Here's Fred Gardner. He's your chair. Have a good day. So the Harris government was not the first one to impose amalgamation, as it were. Metro government was imposed by the province of Ontario under Leslie Frost. Okay, that's worth remembering. Second thing to remember is that the split between the local government, right, Toronto, and the metro government, metropolitan government, where the hard services went to the local government. That's garbage, waste management, all that stuff, and the harder service went to the regional government. So, but all of a sudden, right away, those which were not amalgamated began to be amalgamated. So in 1957, just a short 4 years later, the cops were amalgamated, right? In 1962, all of a sudden, they amalgamated welfare departments. So slowly, by the time you got to David Peterson's government, most of the government had been increasingly put into metro, and the local governments were getting less and less to do. Indeed, when Peterson's government came in, that they they decided that there should be a direct election to the metro government, and we still had direct election to local government. We had done what no other government had ever been able to do. We had 2 elections, 2 different people on the same space. So to me, the 40-year metro government was a terrific experiment that was more a process of continuing to centralize the government for the municipality of Metropolitan Toronto. And so I supported it then. I said it was great, and I support it now. Today, it's just too big. You're not going to get any provincial government to make a more regional government, despite Ann Golden's wonderful report. They're just not going to do it. And so the idea is now, what do we do with those regional governments? The real regional government is the province of Ontario. They're the new
You
metro.
mentioned Ann Golden. Ann Golden, I understand, in 1996 did a GTA report or something like that, and she did recommend amalgamation of Toronto, but she also recommended amalgamation of Peel, amalgamation of Halton, of Durham, of York, and the creation of 5 cities, and that those 5 cities together, or 5 mayors, would form a new GTA council. And Toronto has grown. In fact, Joe Barrett, to go back to him, said that he thought within the next 10 or 20 years, the greater metropolitan area would become the 3rd largest metropolitan area, growing bigger than Chicago in North America. And he said, we need to have a new governance structure if that's how big we're going to become.
I think we have a government structure. It's just not defined yet. And there's been no public discussion, because you're not going to find what happened to Ann's report. She was right, logically, absolutely right. But there's not going to be a provincial government that's going to establish a new regional government that big to be competitive with it. It's just not going to happen. So, I mean, you have to, that's my view at any rate. Let me go a little further, though. To me, the real regional government for Toronto is the Golden Horseshoe. In fact, it's called the Greater Golden Horseshoe, and I just shorted up and called it the Golden Horseshoe. We just started an organization called Friends of the Golden Horseshoe, because the real planning footprint for Toronto is the Golden Horseshoe, and it's made up of 4 already planned areas. The Greater Golden Horseshoe is made up of 4 major plans: the Niagara Escarpment Plan, the Oak Ridges Moraine Plan, the Growth Plan, and the Green Plan. All of those, the Niagara Escarpment was in the 1980s. The others were all in the first decade of this century. They form the basic planning footprint for the Golden Horseshoe. And all of our issues, particularly environmental and land use planning issues, need to pay attention to it.
The tiny perfect mayor decided to run for federal politics. Why'd you do that?
Well, I had spent 3 terms as mayor of Toronto. All the stuff that I had worked on, as I mentioned earlier, and we pretty well done what we said we wanted to do. There were lots of things left to be done, but I'd had 9 years at City Hall, and that seemed to be probably all God was going to allow me. So I was actually going to do something else, which I won't get into, but I was asked if I would run, and I decided I would in 1978 in a by-election. I'd already decided it was not the election municipally was going to be in 1978. The federal election was in October of 78, so I resigned in order to run by 2 months. But the reason I did is, I'll go back a little bit. Before I got involved in local government with my students, I was teaching them Canadian government. My academic background was Canadian government, so it was not new to me. And I've worked a lot with CMHC and other agencies, and there were people that I was involved in who thought I should run, and I agreed with them and did so.
Some people were surprised that you became Minister of Indian and Northern Affairs, the mayor of Toronto in charge of Indian and Northern Affairs.
Yeah, and today they would understand more, right? Today, if it was today, they wouldn't have had the same response as they did then. They wondered, what the heck is the old mayor of Toronto doing in Indian and Northern Affairs? A couple of points. One, I wouldn't have chosen it myself at that time, but Brian Mulroney asked me if I would do that. I had been the communications critic up until that time, and I assumed it might be the Ministry of Communications. But at any rate, I said, okay, well then I began a journey that's now 40 years ago. I began a journey I'm still on, and learn more about Canada, learn more about my understanding and feelings about it, and learn more about my two brothers who both went north. One was in geology and the other a forester, and they were all northern people. And I was now in their boat. And I learned more, as they say, about Canada and Indigenous, about the history of Canada, about Indigenous life. So to me, it was a wonderful, wonderful experience, as it turned out. Wasn't looking for it, but I've lived to see on many occasions when I've taken the opportunity to thank Brian Mulroney for sending me there. His response will be, I knew something that you've forgotten, David, and that was most of the issues. I'm not talking about the status issues of what's the role of Indigenous people in these days, but what are the practical issues of living on reserves? What are the practical living in Aboriginal communities, of which there were about 700 across the country at that time, and everything north of 60 degrees parallel. All of that is now changed, but in those days, they've still got the same old problems they always had. They are, what are they? Well, they are water, clean water. They are transportation. They are communications. They are waste management. What are those issues? They're municipal issues.
City issues.
Okay. And to my great surprise, when I would be able to go to these places, and certainly even up north of 60, which I loved, I had a conversation with people in 300 different reserves, as they were called in those days, right? All about those issues, and also schooling and education, from which I was from. I used to help run a program on what we used to call it. But anyhow, it was long distance learning, and we used to do radio programming to the Arctic. So all of those issues were the real day-to-day guts issues of Aboriginal communities or Indigenous communities, and I was there. So I was only there 2.5 years, but as it turned out, I have continued to work with Indigenous communities. I helped renegotiate the Toronto Purchase in 2010. I mean, I stay with it and still am. So what turned out to be what a lot of people thought was a sack of ashes turned out to me absolutely, in a sense, a reigniting of my life.
My cousin is Jane Stewart, and she was also
oh my God, really?
Indian and Northern Affairs, and
absolutely. I met with her a couple of times. I didn't know her well, but I met with her a couple of times, particularly when we were dealing with some particular issues. And I know she loved it. She had a great friend, Karen Petrie, and Karen and I were great pals. So I know of Jane's affection for that job. It's interesting, Brian, because I used to say and can still say it. One of the things that people who had that job before, they all share a secret. And that secret is how badly we dealt with it all and how we really need to get our act together to do it right. And we're trying to do that. You can get all those old former ministers like that. If you say there's a need out there in your old place, they'll be there, because it was one of the great kind of ugly secrets of Canadian existence that we didn't pay attention.
Well, hasn't that come to all of our attention in the last year with the residential school issue? Anyway, we're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments from David Crombie, the former mayor of Toronto, former Tiny Perfect mayor. And I'm going to ask him about running for leader of the Progressive Conservative Party in 1983. Stay with us, everybody.
So anyway,
welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with David Crombie, the former mayor, Tiny Perfect mayor of Toronto, former federal cabinet minister, member of parliament. And in 1983, you ran for leader of the Progressive Conservative Party. You are the last conservative from sort of downtown Toronto that's ever been elected to the federal parliament. And it was just announced today that a number of MPs within the Conservative caucus in Ottawa have sent a letter to the caucus chair. It's a number enough to ask for a leadership vote. And so we'll see in the next little while if there is going to be a leadership convention. Aaron O'Toole, the current leader, positioned himself as a 905er and someone that could speak to the 905. And I don't know if anyone from the Conservative Party could ever win Toronto, but most people think that if you can't win the 905, or at least the 905 and the 705 and the 519, you can't win government in Canada anymore. Andrew Scheer, the former a leader of the Conservative Party, was positioned far more to the right, far more rural, Western, et cetera. And certainly, maybe some of that has been represented in Parliament Hill in the protest this last weekend, and the Conservative right-wing MPs that have been supporting or at least communicating with the truck convoy protesters. So my question to you is, what's the answer? Could someone like you, could someone from either Toronto or urban Greater Toronto, speaking to, if not the 416, the 905, I'm not sure if this is correct, but maybe a red Tory, could someone like that lead the progressive not the progressive, that's a Freudian slip, the Conservative Party? And frankly, is that what the Conservative Party needs if it's going to actually ever win?
Well, that would be my own bias. I mean, when you said a little faux pas, not the Progressive Conservative Party, it's the Conservative Party. That's really the point. The great Tory governments in Ontario from 1943 to 1985, 41 years in practical terms, they really transformed Toronto because they were both progressive and conservative. Because they did things in a managed way, but they knew they had an imagination about where it needs to go. Let me give you one really good example. Now, I don't want to engender the old car debate from Spadina Expressway, but Bill Davis in 1971 made a statement, which I think probably, and he was then in power for the next 14 years. He said about Spadina that if cities were to be made for automobiles, basically saying, I'm paraphrasing poor Bill, if cities were intended for automobiles, the Spadina would be a good place to start. But if cities are made for people, the Spadina would be a really good place to stop. Now, without the issue itself, what Bill Davis was saying was a whole world was out there and it's changing. And our notion of how far you take the automobile, in those days, it could go anywhere. I used to say that people would park it beside their bed if they could, right? But Bill Davis was way ahead of himself, and he brought his constituency with him. That was the Progressive Conservative Party. He also took the temper of the times, and it was not an ideologically driven thing. He used to say, look, I can only stretch my constituency so far, but he did. So it seems to me that we lost the gold when we got rid of the old notion that we should be both progressive and conservative. Now we've got a party federally at any rate, federally at any rate, who are bound and determined to make sure they're only conservative. And I think that probably that will mean that they'll be in a minority for a very long time.
How do you change that?
The only thing that can recapture it is to understand that the world, people, ordinary people, are both progressive and conservative. That was its magic. It's a contradiction in terms, of course, but so is politics a contradiction, right? It's about contradictions. And so it took talent to manage both progressive and conservative. Any fool could be either one. It takes talent to be both.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens. Only wish that,
well, I think I don't know. I didn't know him, but I remember his father. Oh, poor guy. I saw Aaron O'Toole when he was campaigning. John Crosby was a great friend. And I was out to his wake when he died a year and a half ago. And Aaron was out there hustling votes for the leadership and all. But I mean, again, look at the kind of people. John Crosby, taking John Crosby as an example, he had been a liberal at one time, but he got angry with Joey and joined the Conservative. But there was that kind of fullness of focus. There was a sense that you could bring these things together. Your job was to bring them together, right? And not be one or the other, but try and bring them together. That's the political job.
We're out of time, but maybe why have we become so extremist and partisan? The liberals going more left and the conservatives going more right. Why?
I don't, and I'm not sure that it's more left and right, quite frankly. I'm using conservative and progressive because we were on to those two words. I think it's got more to do with maybe a change in the media structure of media, which gives more voice to more fragmentation to many voices. I think also, I don't know, let me put out a bit of a thought, and that is that things came not easily to us, but we had so much to be able to get and enjoy that somehow we lost the sharpness that comes from need. Not everybody, but some of our decision makers, I mean. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I know I'm babbling because I'm unsure what to do. I have not played a part in the Conservative Party for now the Conservative Party for 20 years, right? And I have not played a part in any political party, but I vote differently. And I vote very often for the person. If I was looking for a Tory guy right now who I enjoy watching and listening to him think and speak, give me Michael Chong. Here's a guy.
He's a progressive conservative.
Absolutely. We need more Chongs.
David Crombie, it's been a real honor and pleasure, sir. I really appreciate you spending tonight with us. And I look forward to hopefully chatting with you again sometime. And thank you for your contribution to political life and to the waterfront of Toronto and to Toronto. You have left a mark that we will all appreciate. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Brian. You keep with the clan now.
Thank you. That's our show for tonight, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. Not in Toronto, but in Mississauga. But you can get me in Toronto on www.saga960am.ca. Thanks for joining us. Good night, everybody.